Hello, and welcome to an overview of educational services for students who are English learners. This presentation is designed to review and expand on the chapter English Language Development Programs and Services, which is contained in the course materials. The objectives for this session are for you to become familiar with the definition of English learners and their educational rights, procedures for identifying and assessing language proficiency, and characteristics of language assistance programs. According to the Every Student Succeeds Act, English learners are between the ages of 3 through 21 and are enrolled or plan to enroll in elementary or high school. They may be born outside of the U.S. or come from an environment where a language other than English is spoken. This definition continues by describing the language and learning challenges that English learners face, which include problems attaining state standards and being successful in English-only classrooms due to difficulties with English in any of the four language domains: speaking, reading, writing, or understanding. In addition to the definition of English learners in the ESSA, the term is described in state law. In Massachusetts, an English learner is a student who does not speak English or whose native language is not English, and who is not currently able to perform ordinary classroom work in English. Over the years, a variety of terms have been used to describe students who are learning English as a new language. A common term in the law is Limited English Proficient, or LEP, but that is not a preferred term in school settings because it emphasizes a deficit perspective. English learners and multilingual learners are preferred terms because they highlight the additive benefits of learning a new language. In the academic literature, emergent bilingual is popular because it is inclusive of all new language learners. There is a growing preference, however, for multilingual learners because it is inclusive of the many kinds of language learners, including heritage language learners and those learning languages in addition to English. Two terms have more specific meanings. Dually identified learners refers to students who have disabilities and are also learning English as a new language. Long-term English learners are students who take a longer than average time to develop comprehensive proficiency in English and continue to qualify for EL services. There are over 5 million English learners in U.S. public schools, accounting for about 10% of the student population. This percentage is expected to increase significantly. English learner representation in classrooms is common, with nearly 2/3 of teachers in the U.S. having at least one student in their classroom who has been identified with English learning needs. Public schools are legally mandated to provide bilingual or other appropriate language assistance services for students who are not yet proficient in English. This legal framework began in 1964 with the passage of Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, which includes the prohibition of discrimination based on national origin. Since that time, court decisions and legislation have helped establish procedures for identifying, assessing, and instructing English learners, including the use of native language in instructional programs. In 1968, the Bilingual Education Act was passed. The Act provided funding for programs for English learning and encouraged the use of native language in instruction. In 1974, the Lau decision made clear that specialized instruction for English learners is necessary for students to benefit from education. Also in 1974, the Equal Educational Opportunities Act required school districts to take action to overcome barriers, including language barriers, to students' equal participation in education. Several years later, in 1981, the court's decision in Castañeda v. Pickard set standards for determining the adequacy of English learning programs. EL programs must be based on educational theory, have sufficient resources, and show evidence of effectiveness. This legal history is apparent in the 2015 Every Student Succeeds Act, under which public schools currently operate. The ESSA holds schools accountable for the progress of English learners. Under ESSA, schools are required to A. Identify and assess all potential EL students in a timely, valid, and reliable manner. B. Provide a language assistance program that is educationally sound and based on demonstrated success, consistent with the decision rendered in Castañeda versus Pickard. C. Provide staff who are well prepared to deliver services in language assistance programs. D. Ensure equal opportunities for EL students to meaningfully participate in all curricular and extracurricular activities of the school. And E. Avoid unnecessary segregation of EL students. Before proceeding, it's important to emphasize that the push for adequate programming for English learners has not been without controversy. This is especially true regarding bilingual programs. At the beginning of the country's history and well into the 1800s, schooling in native languages was common in indigenous and immigrant communities. German, French, Spanish, and Cherokee were among the many languages represented across the nation. But as the political and social landscape changed, actions were taken to restrict instruction to English. Native American students were prohibited from being taught in their home languages as early as the mid-1800s, a practice that lasted well into the 1900s. From the 1920s through 1960s, English only was the policy in many states and communities. Students who did not know English were largely left to fend for themselves in what experts termed the sink or swim model. Although English learners now receive specialized services, public reaction to bilingual education, where students are taught in their home language as well as English, has varied over the years. The English-only movement in the late 1990s resulted in several states banning bilingual education, including Massachusetts, where a ban was in effect from 2003 to 2018. Research showing the benefits of bilingualism and using the home language of students in instruction has been an important factor in changing perspectives and sustaining bilingual education models. As a result of legal actions over the past several decades and the ESSA, we now have a set of general procedures that schools follow to provide appropriate services to English learners. The procedure begins with identifying potential English learners, screening them for proficiency, and then providing services, if needed, until proficiency standards are met. This protocol takes place considering research findings about effective practices as well as engaging parents throughout the process. The first step in the process is the identification of potential English learners. Most states utilize a home language survey, which is a questionnaire that parents or guardians are required to complete upon enrollment of their child in school. The purpose of the questionnaire is to determine if a language other than English is used in the home. If another language is spoken, the student undergoes a screening process to see if they might be eligible for services. On the screen, you will see the home language survey used in Massachusetts, which is available in over 30 languages on the DESE's website. Massachusetts also uses the survey to identify parents who need language assistance. Parents are asked if they will require written materials in their native language and if they will need interpreter services for parent-teacher meetings. Students who are identified as potential English learners on the home language survey are screened for proficiency in English. Language proficiency includes listening, speaking, reading, and writing, and refers to how well a person understands and uses these language functions across a variety of settings and contexts. Many factors influence proficiency in a new language, including proficiency in the home language, opportunities to practice, and how comfortable a student feels using the language, which is referred to as the affective filter. Experts often use the terms social language and academic language to distinguish between everyday communication and the more apt language that is needed to succeed in academic or technical settings. Social language tends to have a concrete context, greeting a friend or asking a cashier a question in a grocery store. Academic language, on the other hand, often takes place without concrete prompts and requires more complex and formal language, explaining a character's motivation in a story, or understanding an essay about artificial intelligence. A common mistake that parents and educators make is to assume a student who displays a good social language also has adequate academic language. This is why formal testing of students is necessary. Massachusetts, along with 40 other states, is part of the WIDA consortium and uses the WIDA assessment tools. The organization is known for the development of the English language proficiency standards, corresponding assessment tools, and professional development for EL educators. For the initial evaluation of potential English learners, the WIDA screener is used to examine proficiency across the 4 language domains: listening, speaking, reading, and writing. Proficiency levels for each domain are generated as well as composite scores. Language proficiency is rated on a scale of 1 to 6. A level 1 score indicates very basic communication skills in English, while a level 6 score indicates that the student's language skills are comparable to those of English proficient peers. Here is a sample test item for listening and understanding oral English. The student taking the test listens to directions and views pictures. In this item, the adult in the picture is pointing and telling the children to look at something. The student must identify which picture matches what the teacher is referring to. In the box labeled Entrance Criteria, you'll see that Massachusetts students who score at 4.0 or lower on the WIDA screener, on the overall composite as well as on the reading and writing composite, are eligible for EL services. Students at the entering, beginning, developing, and the very start of expanding levels of English learning compose this eligible group. As interpreters, you are likely to be assigned to meetings where the results of language proficiency are being discussed with parents. So being familiar with the concepts and vocabulary of the WIDA performance definitions will be helpful in your practice. At the entering stage, for example, students are just starting to become familiar with the language. They can use pictures and graphs and understand and respond to simple words or chunks of language, especially when there is some sort of concrete prompt, like a gesture or a scent. And because they are just learning the language, they will make errors related to phonics or phonetics, which refers to the sounds of the language, syntax, which is the grammar of the language, and semantics, which has to do with the meanings of words and phrases. In the developing stages, students are beginning to use specific and technical language related to content areas. This is the type of language we referred to previously as academic language. Students at these stages use expanded sentences when they speak or write, and any mistakes they make are less likely to impede the substance of their communication. In the advanced stages, students are becoming sophisticated users of specialized and technical language. Their oral and written expressions vary with complexity according to the situation, and their language usage approximates that of English proficient peers. According to experts, reaching proficiency in a new language often ranges from 5 to 7 years or longer, depending on the quality of instruction and opportunities for exposure and practice. Once a student has been determined to need language services, the next step is to match the student with an appropriate program. This depends on several factors, including the models in place in the district, the student's language, and the student's level of proficiency. There are 3 primary types of programs in Massachusetts: transitional bilingual programs, sheltered English instruction, and dual language programs. All include the teaching of English as a second language, or ESL, but they differ regarding their target population, goals, and methods. Transitional bilingual programs are common in districts across the nation where a moderate to high number of students speak the same language. They are most common at the elementary and middle school levels. The goal of the program is to successfully transition students to English-only instruction while providing support in their native language. There is always a strong ESL component in transitional bilingual programs. In some programs, the transition is designed to take place over just a few years. In other programs, the planned transition time is longer. Respectively, these programs are referred to as early exit and late exit TBE programs. In sheltered English immersion programs, English is the language of instruction and is taught to students in a developmentally appropriate fashion. The term sheltered refers to the careful selection of vocabulary and sentence structure so that English usage is not overwhelming to the learner. These programs, as well as similar programs across the country, tend to be offered in districts where a variety of languages are represented. Dual language programs often take place in districts where parents have expressed a desire for their children to develop bilingual, bicultural skills, usually in a non English language and culture common in their community. Programs most often combine children from both language groups, called two-way immersion, but there are also one-way immersion groups where students are from one language group. The longer the duration of the program, the more likely students are to develop bilingual, bicultural skills. The instruction of English as a second language, or ESL, takes place across all program types. There are options for how ESL is delivered. In all cases, teachers are appropriately licensed. Self-contained ESL is most common for beginning ESL learners in secondary school. Instruction takes place in a separate, dedicated class which is a regular part of the student's program. Push-in ESL is provided by an ESL teacher who pushes in or visits the classroom to deliver instruction. Embedded ESL is provided by a dually licensed ESL teacher in typical content area classes. The co-teaching model is also an option. This is where ESL instruction is provided by an ESL teacher along with the classroom teacher. In the remaining model, pull out, students leave their typical classroom and travel to another classroom for ESL instruction. This model is common at the elementary level. School districts are required to notify parents of their decision to provide a language program to eligible students. Parents do not need to actively consent to placement, but if they disagree with the determination of or decline services, they must inform the district. In some cases, parents may agree to services but request that their child is placed in a different program than planned. In other cases, parents may decline or opt out of services entirely. For example, a parent may prefer an ESL program to a bilingual program because they plan to support biliteracy in the home environment. In the ending steps of the protocol, districts conduct an annual assessment of language proficiency to determine progress and adjust instruction when warranted. English learners continue to be evaluated yearly until they meet the criteria for English proficiency specified by their state. Students exiting the program are reclassified as fluent English proficient, and parents are notified of this change of status and programming. In Massachusetts, the WIDA Access for ELs exam is used as the annual evaluation tool. Designed like the WIDA screener, student performance in English is examined across the 4 language domains. To be considered as a candidate for reclassification, DESE requires an overall composite score of at least 4.2, as well as a literacy composite score no lower than 3.9. To conclude, let's apply these policies and protocols to the case of Kasia and Igor, a couple with 2 children, ages 15 and 10, who recently arrived in the U.S. from Poland. As with all families, there are many factors to consider. Both parents speak Polish and English fluently, having been educated in Poland and attaining their university degrees in the U.S. They also have moderate fluency in Russian, having worked in Russia for several years. Their children were largely raised in Poland and Russia. Their younger son, who has Down syndrome, has been exposed primarily to Polish. Their older son attended English classes in Poland and communicates with his parents in both languages. He feels fairly confident about entering an English-only environment and is excited about being in a community that has many languages and cultures. At step 1 in the protocol, Kasia and Igor fill out the home language survey in English. They state they do not require interpreter or translation services, but they do indicate that a mixture of English, Polish, and even some Russian is spoken at home. At step 2, the students are screened, and both are determined to be eligible for services. At step 3, placement decisions are made. The older student will enter the high school's structured English immersion program, while the younger student will receive push-in ESL services in the special education program. At step 4, Kasia and Igor are notified of the school's decision and think the program placements are appropriate. They are especially happy to have dedicated ESL services for their younger son and plan to engage with him in English much more in the home setting. They understand that their children will be evaluated annually for progress in English with the goal of exiting services. It's important to remember that the journey for language diverse families in the school system is unique, depending on the needs of the student and the program offerings in the district. Regardless of the program type, however, the district is to provide high quality instruction that leads to student success.